To millions of wrestling fans around the world, he was Big Papa Pump, the genetic freak, the big bad booty daddy. But to every single person who ever had the misfortune of being on his bad side, backstage, in the ring, or anywhere else on planet Earth, he was simply the most unpredictable and terrifying human being they had ever encountered. Not the strongest wrestler, though he was freakishly strong. Not the most technically gifted, though his amateur credentials were world-class. The most unpredictable, the most volatile. The one guy in the locker room where you genuinely did not know what was going to happen next. Scott Steiner didn't have an off switch. Most wrestlers could separate the character from the person. They could play the bad guy on television and then be perfectly normal behind the curtain. Steiner couldn't, or wouldn't. The line between Big Papa Pump and Scott Rick Steiner was so blurred that even the people closest to him weren't sure where one ended and the other began. He was generous to people he liked, loyal to his friends, a legitimate mentor to younger wrestlers who earned his respect. But if you crossed him, if you disrespected him, if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time when his temper detonated, you were in serious, legitimate danger. In this video, we count down the top 5 times Scott Steiner snapped. Real-life, unscripted moments when the most volatile man in professional wrestling showed the world exactly why every single person in every single locker room he ever walked into was terrified of what he might do next. We're talking about incidents that left wrestlers bloodied, incidents that left legends in tears, incidents so wild that, even in an industry full of larger-than-life personalities, Scott Steiner stood alone as the one man nobody could control. And by the time we reach number 1, you'll hear all about the night Scott Steiner went completely off script on live national television, buried a legend, buried his own company, and then hunted the man down in the parking lot afterward. An incident so brazen, so unprecedented, that it remains one of the most shocking moments in the history of Monday Night Nitro. But before we get to any of that, you need to understand where Scott Steiner came from. Because the man who became Big Papa Pump didn't start as a muscle-bound maniac cutting promos about his freaks and his peaks. He started as one of the most gifted amateur wrestlers the University of Michigan had ever produced. Scott Carl Rick Steiner was born on July 29, 1962 in Bay City, Michigan. A small industrial city on the Saginaw Bay, the kind of place where people worked in factories and on farms and measured a man's worth by what he could do, not what he could say. His older brother Rob, who would become Rick Steiner, was already deep into amateur wrestling by the time Scott got to high school. Scott attended Bay City Western High School, where he competed in both football and wrestling. He wasn't just good at wrestling, he was dominant. His junior year, after returning from a year when school sports were eliminated due to a failed millage vote, Steiner went undefeated and won the Michigan State Wrestling Championship. That loss of a year's competition due to budget cuts burned into his memory. Decades later, he'd still talk about it with an intensity that made clear the wound had never fully healed. From there, Steiner earned a wrestling scholarship to the University of Michigan, one of the most prestigious athletic programs in the country. At Michigan, he became a 3-time Big Ten Conference runner-up and, in 1986, earned NCAA Division I All-American honors after placing 6th in the nation at 190 pounds. His collegiate record was a staggering 125 wins, 51 losses, and 2 draws. He graduated with a degree in education. Think about that for a second. This is a man with a legitimate college degree and legitimate elite-level amateur wrestling credentials. An All-American from the University of Michigan. A state champion? A man who could have gone into coaching or teaching or any number of respectable professions. Instead, he looked at the world of professional wrestling and saw his calling. Years later, Steiner would explain his decision simply. He'd been watching professional wrestling on cable TV for the first time while at Michigan, and after a few months, he turned to his brother and said they could beat those guys. Beat a lot of them up, and he was right. Steiner debuted in professional wrestling in 1986, working initially for the Indiana-based World Wrestling Association under his real name before transitioning to the Continental Wrestling Association in Memphis. By 1989, he had joined his brother Rick in World Championship Wrestling, and the Steiner Brothers were born. And from the very beginning, it was obvious that Scott Steiner was different. not just because of his incredible combination of size, speed, and technical ability. The guy was a chiseled heavyweight doing Frankensteiners and backflip fallaway slams at a time when big men simply did not move like that. But because there was something behind his eyes that told you this man was capable of things that went well beyond professional wrestling, the Steiner brothers became one of the greatest tag teams in history. Multiple WCW World Tag Team Championships, multiple WWE Tag Team Championships, IWGP Tag Team Championships in New Japan Pro Wrestling, where they won the belts in front of over 64,000 fans at the Tokyo Dome. They wrestled everywhere, against everyone, and they dominated. They appeared on the very first episode of Monday Night Raw in January 1993, entering the Manhattan Center in University of Michigan, jackets with the fight song blaring, and they squashed their opponents in under 5 minutes. But the Steiners were known for more than just their in-ring work. Backstage, they were feared. Not just individually, but as a unit. They were serial pranksters, and their idea of a prank would make most human resources departments file criminal charges. They would draw offensive things on the faces of wrestlers who fell asleep in the locker room. They would tape people up. They would intimidate referees and announcers. Arn Anderson, one of the toughest men in wrestling history, a man who literally stabbed Sid Vicious with a pair of scissors during a bar fight, admitted that he never wanted to get on the wrong side of the Steiner brothers. Let that sink in. Arn Anderson, who would fight anybody, drew the line at the Steiners. The most infamous backstage story from the Steiner brothers' early days involved New Japan Pro Wrestling. The World Wrestling Federation was trying to establish a working relationship with NJPW. Important Japanese wrestling executives had flown over for a business meeting with Vince McMahon. Before the meeting could take place, McMahon walked into catering and found all the NJPW executives passed out cold. Somebody had spiked the coffee pot. While the Steiners were never definitively proven to be responsible, WWE Backstage figure Bruce Pritchard has said he is certain it was them. They drugged the Japanese business partners of a multi-million-dollar wrestling corporation. For fun. That was the world Scott Steiner operated in. A world where the normal rules of professional conduct simply did not apply. But it was the singles transformation that turned Scott Steiner from a great wrestler into a legend. In the late 1990s, after a serious back injury limited his acrobatic moveset, Steiner reinvented himself. He bleached his hair, he shaved his head into a mohawk, he bulked up to an almost grotesque level of muscularity. And he became Big Papa Pump, the genetic freak. A character so close to the real person underneath that nobody could tell where the act ended and reality began. At his peak as Big Papa Pump, Steiner was arguably the most feared man in any locker room in the world. Not because he was the best fighter, though his amateur wrestling background made him legitimately dangerous. Not because he was the biggest, though his physique was otherworldly. But because he simply did not care about consequences. He would say anything to anyone. He would fight anyone at any time, and management, whether it was WCW, WWE, or TNA, was essentially powerless to control him. Eric Bischoff, the man who ran WCW during its peak years, summed it up perfectly. He said he liked what Steiner could do in the ring, and his abilities were nothing short of amazing, but he was volatile in and out of the ring. Bischoff's first memory of the Steiner brothers was walking into the backstage area and finding them in the middle of one of their pranks, which on this particular occasion involved a referee whose entire naked body had been wrapped in duct tape. This was Bischoff's introduction to the Steiners. This was day one. It only got worse from there. Volatile is putting it mildly. The announcers feared Steiner too. Mike Tenay and others learned the hard way not to call Scott's top rope Hurricane Rana by the generic Lucha Libre name. The move was the Frankensteiner. Scott had invented it. Scott had named it. And if you called it anything else on commentary, you were going to hear about it. And hearing about it from Scott Steiner was not a conversation anyone wanted to have. So with that context in mind, let's start with number 5, and a story about what happens when you mess with a genetic freak's friends. Number 5. The DDP Backstage Beatdown. This incident happened during the dying days of WCW, around the year 2000, when the company was spiraling out of control and the backstage atmosphere was more chaotic than anything happening on television. And it started, as so many wrestling incidents do, with someone going to management instead of handling things face-to-face. The story goes like this. Diamond Dallas Page's wife, Kimberly Page, reportedly found some drug paraphernalia backstage and claimed it belonged to Tammy Sitch, better known as Sunny. Whether this was actually true has never been definitively established. But Kimberly went to WCW management with the information, apparently looking to get Sitch fired. Scott Steiner was friendly with Sitch, and when he found out what Kimberly had done, he was furious. Not because of the drugs, because she had gone behind someone's back. She had snitched. And in Scott Steiner's world, that was a violation of the code that could not be tolerated. Steiner confronted Kimberly directly. And by confronted, we mean he verbally berated her with the kind of language that would make a sailor blush, and then chased her out of the building. Just flat out, chased her through the backstage area and out the door. A terrified woman running from a 300-pound wall of muscle and rage. Now, DDP was a lot of things. He was one of the hardest workers in the business, a self-made main eventer, a man who had fought for everything he'd ever gotten. But above all else, he was protective of his wife. When he found out that Steiner had chased Kimberly out of the building, he went looking for him. He found Steiner at the gorilla position, the area right behind the curtain where wrestlers wait before going out to the ring. DDP confronted him. Words were exchanged. And then it got physical. What happened next was ugly. Security got between them and separated the two men, but Steiner broke free. He lunged at Page again, and this time, he went for the eyes. Multiple sources have confirmed that Steiner was attempting to gouge DDP's eyes out, using the amateur wrestling techniques he'd honed at the University of Michigan for a purpose they were never intended for. He actually did damage to Page's face before being pulled off again. Security separated them a second time. But here's the thing about trying to restrain Scott Steiner. It takes more than a couple of guys. And the moment the grip loosened even slightly, Steiner would break free and go right back at his target. It was like trying to hold back a freight train with a garden hose. People were genuinely terrified. Not for Steiner. For DDP, because the look in Steiner's eyes was the look of a man who had crossed over into a place where rational thought no longer existed. DDP himself later admitted, with remarkable honesty, that if security hadn't intervened, Steiner would have killed him. Not beaten him up, killed him. And based on everything we know about Scott Steiner's intensity and DDP's fighting ability relative to a former All-American wrestler, that assessment wasn't hyperbole. It was probably accurate. Third-party sources who witnessed the altercation confirmed DDP's account. Multiple people backstage said they were genuinely concerned that Steiner would kill Page before anyone could stop him. This wasn't a wrestling angle. This wasn't a worked shoot. This was a 300-pound genetic freak with Division I wrestling credentials trying to permanently disfigure another human being over a backstage dispute about snitching. The DDP incident established something that would define the rest of Steiner's career. He wasn't just willing to get physical backstage, he was eager for it. And once that switch flipped, once the rage kicked in, there was no reasoning with him. There was no talking him down. There was only violence, and it took multiple people physically restraining him to make it stop. And it would only get worse from there. Now, the DDP incident happened in the year 2000, when Steiner was already a main event singles star. But the truth is, Scott Steiner's inability to coexist with the people around him started long before Big Papa Pump was ever born. Our next entry takes us all the way back to 1992, when Steiner was still half of the greatest tag team in wrestling, and he picked a fight with the one man in WCW who was supposed to be untouchable. Number 4. The Bill Watts Confrontation. This incident happened in 1992, years before Scott Steiner became Big Papa Pump, back when he was still one half of the Steiner Brothers. But it demonstrates that the volatile personality that would later become legendary was already fully formed. Bill Watts had taken over as the head of WCW. Watts was old school, a former wrestler and promoter from the territory days who had run Mid-South wrestling with an iron fist. He was used to being the boss, used to having wrestlers fall in line. used to making decisions and having them accepted without argument. He clearly had never dealt with Scott Steiner before. At this point in 1992, Rick Steiner was injured and Scott was getting a singles push, eventually capturing the WCW World Television Championship. But Watts had plans for the Steiner brothers that Scott did not agree with. Specifically, there were plans to break the team up and have them feud against each other. Scott Steiner didn't want to break up the team. He didn't want to feud with his brother. And unlike most wrestlers who might grumble quietly and go along with the program, Steiner told Watts directly, to his face, in no uncertain terms. The kind of terms that made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. This was a statement. And if Watts didn't like it, they could settle it another way. This wasn't just professional disagreement. This was an all-American amateur wrestler with a volcanic temper, challenging a grizzled old-school promoter's authority in front of everyone. Watts, to his credit, was no pushover. He had been a professional wrestler himself. He had run Mid-South with an iron fist and had dealt with every kind of personality the wrestling business could produce. But there was something about the way Steiner confronted him that went beyond the normal pushback Watts was accustomed to. This wasn't a wrestler lobbying for a better spot. This was a man who seemed perfectly willing to escalate the situation as far as it needed to go. The confrontation was significant enough that Watts, a man not known for backing down from anyone, made a personal decision to not re-sign the Steiner brothers. He wanted them gone. Not because they weren't talented, but because Scott Steiner had challenged his authority so aggressively that Watts felt he could no longer control them. The result was that both Steiner brothers left WCW and jumped to the World Wrestling Federation. Pat Patterson and Bruce Pritchard, two of Vince McMahon's closest advisors, were so enamored with Scott's talent that they pitched McMahon on having Scott enter the 1993 Royal Rumble as a surprise entrant and win the whole thing, with a world title run to follow at WrestleMania. McMahon had reservations about Steiner's height at 6'1", and both brothers wanted to stay together as a team, so the plan was scrapped. Instead, they debuted as the Steiner Brothers, won the WWE Tag Team Championship twice, and appeared on the very first episode of Monday Night Raw in January 1993, wearing their University of Michigan jackets to the ring and entering to the Michigan fight song. Even in the World Wrestling Federation, the Steiners were a handful. Scott started food fights at catering. Not once. Multiple times. He later admitted that he did it again the next night just to see what would happen. At one point, he even requested a personal meeting with Vince McMahon, which was a bold move considering this was shortly after the nails incident where a former wrestler had physically choked McMahon in his own office. The Steiners were eventually not renewed by the WWE, partly because of their backstage behavior and partly because the company simply didn't value its tag division enough to accommodate their personalities. The Bill Watts incident is important because it established a pattern that would repeat itself for the next 2 decades. Scott Steiner versus authority. Scott Steiner versus the people who were supposed to be in charge, whether it was Watts, or Eric Bischoff, or Vince McMahon, or Dixie Carter, the story was always the same. Someone tried to tell Scott Steiner what to do. Scott Steiner told them where they could put those instructions. And the confrontation that followed was always memorable, always combustible, and always ended with everyone involved wishing they had just left Steiner alone. But confronting a wrestling promoter is one thing. It takes guts, sure, but at the end of the day, the worst that can happen is you lose your job. Our next entry takes it to a completely different level. Because Scott Steiner didn't just challenge a man's authority, he challenged an entire corporation's hypocrisy, and he did it without raising a single fist. Number 3. The Triple H drug test power move. This incident happened during Steiner's run in WWE, which lasted from late 2002 to 2004. And while it doesn't involve a physical altercation, it might be the most Scott Steiner moment in the history of Scott Steiner moments. Because it demonstrates not just his volatility, but his intelligence. His ability to read a situation and use his reputation as a weapon. The background is this. Scott Steiner arrived in WWE as one of the most jacked human beings anyone had ever seen. This was 2002. The company was still dealing with the fallout from its steroid scandals of the early 1990s. The wellness policy was in its early stages. And when management looked at Scott Steiner's physique, they decided he needed to take a drug test. Now, Steiner could have simply taken the test. He could have refused and faced the consequences. Instead, he did something that was simultaneously hilarious, brilliant, and utterly devastating. He told WWE management that he would be happy to take the drug test, on one condition. Triple H had to pick him up in a limousine and they would go take the test together. That's it. That was his response. Take the test with Triple H, the company's top star, the man who was married into the McMahon family, the man whose physique had undergone its own rather dramatic transformation over the years. The message was crystal clear. If you're going to test me, test everyone. If you're going to question my body, question his too. And if you're not willing to do that, then don't come to me with your drug test. WWE never asked Scott Steiner to take a drug test again. Steiner later told the story with obvious relish in multiple interviews, laughing about it. He maintained that he had never failed a drug test in his life, which is technically true, largely because after this incident, nobody ever tested him. The Triple H drug test story shows a different side of Steiner's snap moments. This wasn't mindless rage. This was calculated. This was a man who understood the power dynamics of the situation, who knew exactly where the hypocrisy lay, and who used his own fearsome reputation to expose it. He didn't need to throw a punch. He didn't need to chase anyone through a building. All he needed was one sentence, delivered with the quiet confidence of a man who knew that nobody in that building had the nerve to call his bluff. That's power. Real power. The kind that doesn't come from a title belt or a main event spot. The kind that comes from being the one person in the room that everybody else is afraid of. Now, if the Triple H story showed you how Steiner could weaponize his brain, our next entry shows you what happened when all rational thought went out the window entirely. When the enemy wasn't a wrestler, or a promoter, or a corporation. When the enemy was death itself. Number 2. The Puerto Rico near-death experience. This one isn't about Steiner snapping on another person. This is about Scott Steiner snapping on death itself, refusing to accept it, fighting against his own mortality with the same stubborn, irrational intensity that he brought to everything else in his life. It was 2007. Steiner was working for TNA, doing a house show tour in Puerto Rico. During a tag team match, a wrestler named Apollo delivered a kick that connected flush with Steiner's throat. It wasn't intentional, it wasn't malicious, it was an accident. The kind of thing that happens in professional wrestling every day. But this time, the consequences were catastrophic. After the match, Steiner started feeling strange. Cold, unable to swallow. He tried eating but couldn't get food down his throat. Then the shaking started, and he began coughing up blood. Not a little blood, significant amounts. He had suffered a torn trachea. His windpipe had been ripped open by the impact of that kick. This is a life-threatening injury. People die from this. At the hospital, doctors told him he had 5 hours to live. The damage was severe enough that fluid was accumulating in his lungs, and his condition was deteriorating rapidly. Steiner ended up at a local hospital in Puerto Rico, the same hospital, as Steiner himself would later note, where Bruiser Brody had died years earlier. And this is where the story becomes pure Scott Steiner, because any normal person in this situation would lie still, follow the doctor's orders, and pray for the best. Scott Steiner repeatedly tried to leave the hospital. He wanted to fly out on a private jet. The doctors told him absolutely not. The change in air pressure from a flight at that altitude, combined with the damage to his trachea and the fluid in his lungs, would almost certainly kill him. A normal person would accept this. Steiner was not a normal person. He kept trying to leave. He kept arguing with the medical staff. He was, even in a life-threatening medical emergency, the most difficult patient anyone in that hospital had ever dealt with. Eventually, the doctors had to put him in a medically induced coma. Not just because his body needed it to heal, but because it was the only way to get Scott Steiner to stop fighting long enough for them to actually save his life. He spent 2 days in the coma, 2 weeks having fluid drained from his lungs, and when he was finally stable enough to travel, he couldn't fly. The air pressure risk was still too great. So he took a cruise ship back to the United States. A cruise ship, because a private jet might kill him, and Scott Steiner doesn't die on a hospital bed in Puerto Rico. The Puerto Rico incident is revealing because it shows that Steiner's intensity, his refusal to accept limitations, wasn't just a wrestling persona. This was a man who was literally dying, who had a hole in his windpipe and his lungs filling with fluid, and his first instinct was to fight the doctors and try to leave. Most people's survival instinct tells them to be still and let the professionals work. Steiner's survival instinct told him to fight everyone in the room and get on a plane. That same intensity, that same irrational refusal to accept any authority over his body or his decisions, is what made him so dangerous in every other situation on this list. And now we arrive at number 1. We've seen Steiner snap on wrestlers. We've seen him snap on promoters. We've seen him snap on corporations. We've even seen him snap on death. But nothing on this list compares to what happened next. Because this is the night Scott Steiner went to war with a legend, with his own company, and with the entire concept of scripted professional wrestling, all at the same time. On live television, with millions of people watching. And nobody could do a single thing to stop him. Number 1. The Ric Flair shoot promo and parking lot confrontation. This is the moment. The one that gets talked about whenever Scott Steiner's name comes up in any conversation about wrestling. The night that Big Papa Pump proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that there was no script in the world that could contain him. It was February 7th, 2000, Monday Nitro, Tulsa, Oklahoma. WCW was in freefall. The ratings were dropping. The competition with the World Wrestling Federation was essentially over, even though nobody wanted to admit it yet. Backstage, the company was a mess. Different factions pulling in different directions. No clear leadership. No consistent vision. And in the middle of all that chaos, Scott Steiner decided he had something to say. Now, to understand why this happened, you have to go back 9 years. To January 1991, Clash of the Champions 14. A young Scott Steiner, still part of the Steiner Brothers, was given a singles match against Ric Flair for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. This was supposed to be a star-making moment, the match where Steiner proved he could hang at the highest level. The match went nearly 25 minutes and ended in a time limit draw. On paper, that sounds like a good result for the challenger. A draw with the world champion should elevate you. But Steiner didn't see it that way. He believed, with absolute conviction, that Ric Flair had deliberately sandbagged him during the match. That Flair had slowed the pace down during moments designed to showcase Steiner's ability. That there was a suspicious timing issue with the clock running out, just as Steiner appeared to have Flair pinned. According to Arn Anderson, who was close to Flair, the animosity was mostly one-sided. Flair didn't think he had done anything wrong. He was working as a heel champion, and heel champions stall and slow things down. That's what they do. But Steiner was convinced that Flair had deliberately sabotaged his big moment, and that conviction hardened into something permanent. Something that festered for nearly a decade. And on that night in Tulsa, it erupted. Steiner grabbed a microphone on live television and delivered what was, and remains, one of the most vicious shoot promos in the history of professional wrestling. None of it was scripted, none of it was approved. He was supposed to be cutting a normal heel promo, but instead he turned his attention to Ric Flair and opened fire. He called Flair a jealous old man who had stolen his entire persona from the real Nature Boy, Buddy Rogers. He accused Flair of being responsible for getting Steve Austin fired from WCW, a claim that cut deep because of how Austin's departure had become one of the biggest mistakes in WCW history. He called Flair the biggest backstage politician in the history of the business. He used language so vicious, so personal, that it went far beyond anything that could be dismissed as part of a character. And then, in what might be the most stunning moment of the entire Monday Night Wars, he told the audience that if they wanted to watch something good, they should change the channel to the WWE and watch Stone Cold Steve Austin. He said WCW sucked on WCW television. While the Monday Night Wars were still being fought, even if WCW was losing badly, he was actively sabotaging his own employer on their own airwaves. A WCW wrestler. On WCW television. During the Monday Night Wars. Telling people to stop watching WCW and watch the competition instead. In the history of professional wrestling, nothing like this had ever happened before on live television. The control room didn't cut his microphone, whether that was because they were in shock or because WCW's management structure was so broken that nobody had the authority to pull the plug, or because somewhere deep down they knew this was the most compelling television their dying show had produced in months. Steiner was allowed to finish. Every word, every insult, every devastating, career-destroying syllable. When he finally walked through the curtain and back into the backstage area, Steiner expected a confrontation. He was ready for one. He wanted one. He was hoping Flair would be there, face to face, so they could settle it right then and there. But Flair wasn't there. According to Steiner's own account, told in numerous shoot interviews over the years, somebody told him that Flair had gone into a room and started crying. Flair, the 16-time world champion, the dirtiest player in the game, the man who had wrestled 60-minute Broadways against every legend in the sport, was in a room backstage in tears. Steiner wasn't satisfied. The next night, at the Thunder tapings, Steiner received word that he was being suspended. As he was walking through the parking lot, he spotted Flair. According to Steiner, he went straight at him. Flair immediately started backing away, claiming he had nothing to do with the suspension. Steiner asked if that was the case. Then why did Flair know about it? The confrontation grew heated enough that those present thought it might turn physical at any moment. What we do know is that Flair and J.J. Dillon had tried to get Steiner fired entirely. They failed. Steiner received a 2-week suspension, with pay. This was WCW in the year 2000. The inmates were running the asylum and Scott Steiner was the most dangerous inmate of all. In his autobiography, Flair responded to the incident. He admitted that yes, WCW sucked, but it wasn't smart to advertise that on your own show. He denied playing any role in Steve Austin's firing. And he dismissed Steiner's wrestling abilities, calling him mid-card talent who drew no money and had no legacy. He said people would forget Steiner the minute he retired. For the record, it's now been over 2 decades since that promo, and people are still talking about it. The Steiner Math promo gets millions of views on YouTube. The Flair Shoot promo is a staple of every wrestling compilation, and Scott Steiner was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2022 alongside his brother Rick. People did not forget him. The Ric Flair Shoot promo stands as the defining moment of Scott Steiner's career because it represents everything he was. The raw, unfiltered aggression, the refusal to follow anyone's script, the willingness to burn every bridge, alienate every ally, and destroy every relationship for the sake of saying exactly what was on his mind. He didn't care about the consequences. He didn't care about the company. He didn't care about his own career. In that moment, all he cared about was making Ric Flair pay for something that had happened 9 years earlier. That's the kind of grudge that transcends professional wrestling. That's personal. That's primal. And when it finally erupted on live television, with millions of people watching, it created a moment that will never be forgotten. Now, there are a couple more stories worth mentioning. Stories that didn't quite make the top 5, but that perfectly capture who Scott Steiner was in his totality. The first happened in 2015 during WrestleMania 31 weekend. By this point, the Steiner brothers hadn't been inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame yet, but Steiner was still a figure in the wrestling world, and his hatred for Hulk Hogan had been building for years. He blamed Hogan for the demise of WCW. He blamed Hogan's backstage politics for ruining the company from the inside out. And he had been publicly vocal about it on social media for a long time. Hogan was scheduled to induct Macho Man Randy Savage into the WWE Hall of Fame that year in San Jose, California. Steiner thought this was an insult. He believed, and he wasn't alone in this, that Hogan and Savage had genuine real-life heat, and that Hogan inducting Savage was a hypocritical act. On March 26th, Hogan's wife Jennifer flew into the San Jose airport. At the baggage claim, Scott Steiner approached her. According to Jennifer's account, which was reported to police and later covered by TMZ, Steiner grabbed her and told her he was going to kill Terry, Hogan's real name, as soon as Hogan's plane landed. Jennifer said she didn't even recognize Steiner at first. She called Hogan immediately, and the next morning they filed a police report. Steiner told a different version. He said he approached Jennifer only to talk some serious smack about Hogan inducting Macho Man and that the idea he had threatened anyone was ridiculous. He pointed out that there were police officers all over the airport and that if Jennifer had felt genuinely threatened, she could have talked to them immediately. His exact quote was, "It's not my fault Hulk Hogan is afraid of me." WWE banned Steiner from the entire WrestleMania weekend. They posted his photograph at security stations around the arena so that every guard at every entrance would recognize him if he tried to get in. Hogan reportedly threatened to no-show the Hall of Fame ceremony and WrestleMania 31 entirely if Steiner was allowed inside the building. Steiner was investigated for felony terrorist threats. The case ultimately went nowhere. But the image is incredible. A man so feared by Hulk Hogan, perhaps the most famous wrestler in history, that Hogan demanded an entire security apparatus be erected just to keep this one person out of the building. Photos of Scott Steiner circulated to every entrance. Guards on high alert. All because one man walked up to a woman in an airport and said some words. That's the kind of fear Scott Steiner generated. Not through weapons, not through armies of people, just by being himself. Just by existing in the same space as someone he didn't like. The second story is about Petey Williams. When Williams was a young wrestler in TNA, management paired him with Steiner in what seemed like an odd couple storyline. Williams became Little Petey Pump, dressing like Steiner, mimicking his mannerisms, playing the comedy sidekick. Most people expected Steiner to eat Williams alive, to bully him, to use him as a punching bag. Instead, Steiner took Williams under his wing. He mentored him. He gave him genuine advice about the business. He protected him from the vultures that prey on young wrestlers trying to find their footing. The two developed a real friendship that lasted years beyond their on-screen partnership, even reuniting in 2019 for tag matches together. And then there's the night in March 2020 at an Impact Wrestling taping in Atlanta, when Steiner collapsed backstage and stopped breathing. His heart had to be shocked with a defibrillator. He was rushed to the hospital where he underwent a heart procedure. The man who had survived a torn trachea in Puerto Rico, who had fought off doctors and defied medical advice his entire life, was finally brought down not by another wrestler, not by a weapon, but by his own body giving out. He survived. Because of course he did. Scott Steiner doesn't die backstage at a wrestling show. That would be too ordinary for a man who has never done anything ordinary in his entire life. That's the contradiction of Scott Steiner. The same man who tried to gouge DDP's eyes out. The same man who reduced Ric Flair to tears. The same man who fought off doctors while dying in a Puerto Rico hospital. The same man who terrified Hulk Hogan so completely that an entire security operation was built just to keep him away. That same man could be generous, protective, and genuinely caring towards someone he decided was worth caring about. The difference was always the same. Earn Steiner's respect, and he would walk through fire for you. Cross him, and he would burn the entire building down with you inside it. They don't make them like Scott Steiner anymore. And honestly, the world's cardiologists are probably grateful for that. But the wrestling business is less interesting for it. Less dangerous, less unpredictable, less electric. Because when Big Papa Pump was in the building, anything could happen, and it usually did. Tell us in the comments about your favorite Scott Steiner moments. Like and subscribe for more hard-hitting wrestling documentaries. Holla if you hear me.